Welcome back to part 2 of our 2-part Troubleshooting for Pointed Pen Calligraphy series. If you missed part 1, make sure you check out the link below. We'll have it linked for you there. Otherwise, let's get started talking about some of those common issues that arise while you're practicing your pointed pen calligraphy. To start off for this week, let's talk about ink blobbing. So how do you avoid ink blobs? There's a lot of different reasons that your ink could be blobbing. First, you have too much ink on your nib or you're pressing too hard. You might have dry ink blocking the tip of the nib and then you press too hard to get rid of that dry ink and then the ink just blobs out in a mess. You could be writing with too little ink in your jar. So if your ink jar is getting low, maybe 1/4 of an inch or less, and you can't fully cover your vent with ink anymore, it's time to dump the contents of that jar into a new jar, provided you haven't mixed your ink with anything like water or ink thickener, just so that you can fully get your nib into the ink when you're dipping. Another tip to help you avoid ink blobbing would be to wipe the top of your nib against the lip of the jar when you remove it, just to keep the excess ink back in the jar rather than out on your page. Make sure that your ink is the ideal consistency, so not too thick. You might need to add a little bit of water into it to get it to flow off the nib a little bit easier. And just remember not to re-dip your nib until you actually have no ink in the reservoir. So if you're re-dipping constantly before you're out of ink, the ink is going to seep up into the pen holder and just come out at an unwanted time when you're not expecting it. So that's not ideal. So just make sure that your reservoir is empty before you re-dip your nib into the ink. Another common issue that comes up is the nib catching repeatedly on the upstroke. So if your nib is catching on almost every upstroke, you want to check a few things. The first thing that you're going to check is the direction of the tip of the nib. Is the nib pointed toward the top edge of the paper? Never point your nib toward the left side of the paper. If your nib is pointing toward the left, it's going to drag as you're trying to pull it upward, and it will catch and snag in the paper. So you want to try to avoid that. The second thing you want to check is your pressure. So you want to press lighter. Actually, you don't want to press at all ever on an upstroke. So when you're doing an upstroke, you should not be pressing down into the paper. If you're pressing down, the sharp metal tip of the nib is going to catch in the paper and snag and flick ink over what you're doing. So if the nib is catching, try to release some of that pressure and then put the nib back down and continue gliding on your upstroke, never pressing into the paper on the upstroke. And last, if you've checked both of those first two and you're still having trouble, you want to replace your nib. Most likely your nib has gone dull by this point. The nibs don't last forever. They only have a lifespan of 10 to 12 hours in the beginning. Once you get used to working with pen and ink, you can kind of expand that out. Depending on how hard you're pressing down or the type of paper that you're using. Okay, so our next tip has to do also with the nib. So as you can see, a lot of troubleshooting actually comes down to the nib. The nib is the point that makes the contact with the paper, so that makes perfect sense. So there is such a thing as a bad nib. So sometimes you'll go to start writing and right off the bat, you'll notice something is a little bit off with your nib. So you'll want to pick the pen up and just take a look. Look at the tines. Are the tines perfectly aligned or are they kind of splayed a bit? Sometimes one of the tines will get bent or dented in shipping from the manufacturer to your desk. And if that's the case, you might be able to kind of carefully bend it back into place. But if it's still not working, you'd probably just want to take that nib out and put a new one in. Also, if you accidentally knock your pen off the table, which happens to me all the time, it will 99% of the time land tip down into the floor, and usually that's going to damage the tip of your nib. Once one tine is bent, the nib isn't going to function properly anymore. So if that's the case, you're going to want to just take that nib out and throw it away. Remember that your nibs do have a lifespan of 10 to 15 hours, especially when you're just getting used to writing with pointed pen. But if you just put your nib in and it's giving you a lot of trouble, it's probably best to just replace it. You never want to be fighting with your nib. And our final tip for today also deals with the nib. So it has to do with the angle of your nib. You never want to have your nib sticking out beyond the edge of your pen holder. This happens mostly in pen holders that have the plastic flange on them, and you can't push the larger nibs like the Nico G all the way back, and so the tip of the nib sticks out way too far. So if your nib is sticking out too far, you can't get the right angle to form your letters properly, and you're just not going to be positioned properly for writing in pointed pen. So if you have one of those plastic pen holders, you might want to look into one with a brass flange so that you can use the larger nibs. They can accommodate more sizes of nibs. If you're looking to get a brass holder, every pen holder we sell in our shop has a brass holder, and they accommodate a larger variety of different sizes of nibs so that you can have the tip of the nib centered with the diameter of your pen holder and never pushed out beyond that point. If you want to stick with the pen holder that you have to use a smaller nib, so like a Gillette 404 or a Gillette 303, Hunt 56, any nib like that where they're smaller and they're not going to stick out as far. So the main thing to keep in mind here is that the tip of your nib shouldn't stick out past the center of the diameter of your pen holder. If it is, you want to look at the size of your nib and see if you need to put a different type of nib in or get a different pen holder. I hope you found these additional troubleshooting tips helpful. Again, if you missed part 1 of this little series, you can check that out linked below, along with all the resources and tools that I mentioned in this video. If there's anything that you're having trouble with that I did not cover, you can also put it in the comments and we can either reply or try to come up with a new video for you in the future. So make sure you let us know. Thanks so much, and we'll see you back next time.